In August of 2021, a young woman in Georgia stood on the street watching in amazement as people in white hazmat suits carried dozens of items out of her house inside of plastic Ziploc bags. It looked like her beloved home was now being used as the set for a science fiction film. But the woman knew that the unfolding disaster in front of her was all too real. Her daughter had recently become infected by a deadly, mysterious bacteria, and nobody had any idea where it had come from. So not only were this woman and her family at risk, but thousands of other people could be too. That's why, on this warm summer afternoon, officials from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, were scouring this woman's property, gathering samples of soil, plants, food, and other household items for their laboratories to analyze. As the woman stood in front of her house out on the road, she closed her eyes and prayed that the CDC's search of her home would be successful. Something in her house had already nearly killed her daughter. If they couldn't find the source of the bacteria, her home would continue to be a danger to the people she loved the most. Josie Baker smiled as she watched her 4-year-old daughter, Lila, hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house. Josie's other daughter, 1-year-old Adelaide, gripped her mother's hand as she wobbled forward to see what her big sister was up to. On this sunny afternoon in late March of 2021, the 24-year-old mother felt like her dreams were actually coming true. Just over a year ago, Josie had moved into this small house in the farmlands north of Dallas, Texas, with her family. They all loved the fresh air and wide open space, and little Lila had become close friends with the cows that grazed in the pasture next door. Josie shared her daughter's love of animals. She actually worked as a veterinary assistant in a local animal hospital, and the family had even taken in a pet raccoon named Jinx. Josie checked her watch and realized her husband, Dustin, would be home soon from his job as a firefighter and paramedic, and so she needed to start fixing dinner. She called out to Lila and scooped up baby Adelaide. Then the whole crew headed for the back door of their house. But the moment Josie stepped inside the house, she was overwhelmed by a strong floral smell, like someone nearby was wearing way too much perfume. Josie held her nose and peeked inside the kitchen. And it was a total mess. Cabinet doors were wide open, and it looked like the food inside had been hurled across the room. Boxes of cereal and bags of chips were ripped open and spilled all over the counter and the floor. The cabinet under the kitchen sink was also open, and broken bottles of dishwashing detergent and other cleaning supplies were spread out all over the place. And when Josie looked closely, she saw something else. Tiny animal footprints tracking the mess out of the room. Now, Josie knew exactly what had happened to her kitchen. Jinx, their raccoon, had ransacked it. Jinx was supposed to live in an enclosure in the living room, but clearly he'd escaped and decided to have some fun in the kitchen. Josie ultimately found Jinx hiding under the bed in Lila's bedroom, and while she was mad, she couldn't really stay mad at him as he stared out at her with his little black cute eyes. And so Josie coaxed him out with some food before picking him up and returning him to his pen. As she swept up the broken glass in the kitchen, Josie felt like she actually had kind of dodged a bullet here. Because, this could have been a whole lot worse if maybe her girls had come into the house ahead of her and maybe got cut on all the shards of glass lying around. And so as she dumped the trash into a wastebasket, she had to admit to herself that all in all, the whole scene in front of her was actually kind of funny. While the house may be a total mess and a total pain to clean up, one thing was certain. Their little raccoon Jinx, after breaking into all the cleaning supplies, was now the sweetest smelling raccoon in the state of Texas. 2 weeks later, after tucking in the girls for the night, Josie walked back out to the living room to snuggle up on the couch with her husband Dustin. But when she stepped into the room, she found Dustin standing in the corner, staring into Jinx's enclosure. Josie was curious, and so she walked over to see what he was looking at, and when she looked down, she gasped. Jinx was acting so weird. The raccoon swayed and staggered as he walked around his enclosure, almost like he was drunk. He also kept bumping into objects and walls, which made Josie think maybe his vision was impaired. Because of her job as a veterinary technician, Josie had been around plenty of sick animals, but Jinx's condition was something she'd actually never seen before in any other animal. So she told Dustin that she would bring Jinx with her to the animal hospital first thing in the morning. The next morning, Josie stood by while one of the vets at her hospital examined her raccoon. But after a few minutes, the vet turned to Josie and admitted that they too were totally stumped by whatever was bothering Jinx. They didn't understand what it was. Josie agreed that the best course of action now would be to keep Jinx under observation at the hospital and run some additional tests. But over the course of his stay, nothing the veterinarians did seemed to help Jinx, and in fact, Jinx just seemed to get sicker and sicker until he basically just lay in his cage, panting with his tongue out. And then 2 days after he had come to the hospital, Jinx died. Josie was devastated, but she was far more concerned about how her daughter Lila would react to Jinx's passing. She was going to be absolutely heartbroken. The day after Jinx's death, the Baker family walked solemnly down the path behind their house towards the stream, and they buried Jinx under a tree. At the end of the service, Josie kneeled down and helped a very sad Lila plant flowers atop her beloved pet's final resting place. A few weeks later, on the afternoon of May 29th, Josie sat on her living room couch right next to Lila, who for the past couple of days had been vomiting and running a fever. Her pediatrician had said that it was probably just the stomach flu and recommended rest and fluids. So Josie had pulled together all these pillows and blankets and put them on the couch to let her daughter relax and watch TV while she recuperated. However, as Josie looked at her sleeping daughter beside her, she felt increasingly worried. Josie had been carefully following the doctor's instructions, but Lila's fever really hadn't broken yet, and she was still struggling to keep her food down. Lila had been sleeping for a couple of hours now, so Josie gently placed her hand on Lila's forehead and whispered to her to wake up so she could drink some water. But as Lila slowly opened her eyes, Josie could see that they looked glazed over and unfocused. Josie tried to help Lila sit up, but the little girl could barely lift her head. Josie immediately wrapped her daughter in a blanket and carried her to the car. Her barely conscious 4-year-old needed to see a doctor right away. Later that day, Josie climbed out of an ambulance outside of the Children's Hospital in Dallas, Texas, while orderlies ran to help unload Lila from the back. The doctor at their local hospital, where Josie had gone first, had told Josie that based on her daughter's condition, this local hospital could not help her. They needed specialized care. So Lila had been rushed in an ambulance to a major pediatric hospital instead. Once Lila was unloaded from the ambulance, she was immediately taken up to the intensive care unit. At the same time, a doctor named Catherine Merrill met with Josie in the hallway to explain what they were going to do to treat her daughter. Dr. Merrill said that Lila's white blood cell count was very high, which was a strong indicator that Lila was fighting off an infection. Josie listened carefully as the doctor laid out the range of tests they planned to run to try to figure out where this infection came from and where it was located in Lila's body. Dr. Merrill also explained that while the testing was in progress, they would also be administering antibiotics to Lila to help her fight off whatever this infection was. As they talked, Josie could hear her daughter throwing up again, so Josie quickly thanked the doctor and rushed back to her daughter's bedside. Over the next couple of days, the doctors and nurses and medical team ran dozens of tests on Lila, but unfortunately, the results of those tests didn't really tell them anything. All the tests could confirm was that whatever was going on with Lila was not one of the common suspects, like bacterial meningitis or a foodborne disease like salmonella. And as each test came back basically showing nothing, Dr. Merrill became more and more confused. Meanwhile, Lila's condition grew even worse. Her frequent vomiting caused her to have trouble breathing, which led to low oxygen levels in her blood. So Dr. Merrill decided to insert a breathing tube through Lila's nose and down her windpipe, requiring the little girl to be heavily sedated. Lila's illness consumed the entire family, as first Josie and then Dustin took leave from their jobs so they could spend more time at the hospital with their girl. But day after day, no new information came in, and Lila kept getting worse. Not only was she completely incapable of holding her head up now, she couldn't even walk or speak. And so it wasn't long before Josie and Dustin began to fear the worst, that they might never get their sweet, energetic 4-year-old back. One night in June, nearly 2 weeks after Lila got sick, Dr. Merrill entered Lila's hospital room and found her parents at her bedside as usual. After giving Lila an extensive examination, Dr. Merrill thought that this infection was actually attacking Lila's brain and nervous system. In order to find out for sure, Lila's doctors would perform a brain biopsy, which meant they would cut a small opening in Lila's skull to acquire tiny samples of her brain tissue. Josie thought that sounded like a very intense operation for such a young girl in such a weakened state already, but the brain biopsy was also their best remaining hope to find out what was going on with her. So Josie and Dustin looked at each other for a moment, and it was clear they both understood they didn't really have a choice here. They had to do this, so they told Dr. Merrill to go ahead with the procedure.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life.
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
Which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Marilyn and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
Later, Josie sat by Lila's hospital bed and read to her from her favorite book, while Dustin napped nearby in a chair. Lila was still not able to speak or walk, but she had made it through the brain biopsy just fine and was actually starting to show small signs of improvement. And so Josie was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in a while. But moments later, Dr. Merrill entered and pulled up a chair to speak with the parents. The results had come back from the brain biopsy, and there was finally an answer to what was ailing their daughter. But the answer was not a good one. Dr. Merrill said that Lila was suffering from a rare and potentially deadly bacterial infection known as melioidosis. The doctor explained that once this bacteria invades a person's system, it causes pus-filled abscesses in whatever tissue it reaches, which is why nearly 40% of melioidosis patients die. And in Lila's case, the bacteria had entered her brain and nervous system, which was why she was having so much trouble moving and speaking, and seemed very disoriented. All of this was obviously totally devastating to Josie and Dustin, but the doctor told the very upset parents that there actually was reason for hope. Now that they actually knew which bacteria was making their daughter sick, they could give her the right antibiotics to help Lila try to defeat the infection once and for all. 2 weeks after Lila's brain biopsy, a woman in her 20s named Julia Petrus arrived at the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, in Atlanta, Georgia, for her first day as an epidemic intelligence officer. For years, Julia had worked as a nurse, providing health services to refugees in Bangladesh and Uganda. More recently, she provided medical care for homeless people in Santa Barbara, California, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And now she was excited to take on a new challenge. As an epidemic intelligence officer, Julia was now basically a disease detective who would investigate mysterious outbreaks and do her best to prevent the spread of infections. As Julia sat down at her desk and checked her email inbox for the first time, she could see that she was already invited to a Zoom meeting that was starting in just a few minutes. CDC officials would be briefing the FBI about a recent outbreak of melioidosis, a very rare bacterial infection. Julia was familiar with melioidosis, but she didn't understand why this disease would involve the FBI, an agency that investigates crimes. But regardless, moments later, Julia clicked the link on her calendar and logged into the Zoom meeting. After a quick round of introductions, a CDC official began the briefing with a discussion of the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, who was still in the Dallas Children's Hospital suffering from melioidosis. Julia also learned from this meeting that 2 other cases of melioidosis had been reported in the US in the last 4 months. There was a woman in Kansas who died 9 days after being admitted to the hospital, and a man in Minnesota who was still fighting his symptoms. But there was something strange about all 3 of these cases. Melioidosis was caused by a bacteria that, for all intents and purposes, did not exist in the United States. The bacteria was mostly found in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Usually, the only way a person in the United States got melioidosis was by traveling to a region of the world where the bacteria was present. But none of these 3 patients had traveled outside the United States anytime recently. Julia could understand why the CDC wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. It obviously was in their purview, but she still wasn't sure why the FBI was on this call with them. And it was at this point that one of her colleagues reminded the other attendees on the meeting that this bacteria was so toxic that it was classified as a Tier 1 select agent, and the federal government viewed it as a potential weapon if it got into the wrong hands. And so at this point, the official said the CDC could not rule out the possibility that this melioidosis bacteria had been released into the United States intentionally. Meaning this could potentially be an act of bioterrorism, which is why the FBI was now being briefed up on the situation. Julia was absolutely shocked at this revelation. This was quite an assignment for her first day on the job, and it wasn't even lunchtime. Before her wild first day at the CDC was over, Julia had ordered DNA analysis from the bacteria that was collected from the 3 patients. And within days, the results confirmed exactly what the CDC had feared. The 3 samples were genetically identical, meaning they had all come from the same place. And further investigation revealed to Julia and her colleagues that this particular strain of bacteria could be traced to southern Asia. Julia's next question was, how did the bacteria move all the way from Asia to 3 separate households in the United States? Had it come here on an infected plant or animal, in soil, or a commercial product? Or could it actually have been spread by a bioterrorist who just wanted to hurt people? There were literally thousands of possibilities, and Julia knew that the only way to narrow them down was to find out what the 3 victim households had in common. So she picked up the phone and started calling all the families of the victims. She needed to let them know that the CDC was going to go to their homes and search them. A few days later, Julia drove through the wide-open farmlands of northern Texas on her way to the home of the Baker family. The day before, she had spoken with Josie and Dustin Baker about the need for her to come and collect samples from their property. Other CDC officers were going to scour the homes of the patients from Kansas and Minnesota with the same goal, finding melioidosis bacteria. As Julia pulled her car into the gravel driveway in front of the Baker's home, a woman came out and introduced herself as Josie's sister. She said that Josie and Dustin were still at the hospital with Lila, but she was here now to let Julia know that she had free rein to collect whatever material she thought was relevant to her investigation. Julia thanked her, then started searching every inch of the Baker property for anything that looked like it could have come from Asia. She collected samples of food and cleaning products and placed them in plastic bags. Then she scraped algae from an empty aquarium she found behind the house, since there had been cases where imported tropical fish carried the deadly bacteria. Finally, Julia took soil samples from the bank of the stream near the house, as well as from the plants. As Julia waved to the sister and drove away from the Baker's home, she felt she had been very thorough in her investigation. Although she was still new to this job, she felt like it was very possible to her that the bacteria they were looking for was hidden inside one of the bags and bottles in the trunk of her car right now. A couple of weeks later, in late July, Julia sat in a conference room with the other CDC investigators on her team. Julia scrolled through the pages of laboratory results on her laptop, but she admitted to her colleagues that she was totally stumped. Investigators had gathered hundreds of samples from the 3 locations where people got sick, but none of them contained any trace of the bacteria. But before Julia could start to discuss next steps, one of her colleagues cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. Then he read out loud from an email that had just come in on his phone. And as he read, Julia grew even more troubled. The CDC had just gotten word of a 4th case of melioidosis. This one was in Georgia. The patient was a 5-year-old boy who, like the other 3 patients, had never traveled to any region of the world where this bacteria was present. DNA analysis showed that the bacteria that infected him was identical to the samples from the other 3 patients. So he'd most likely gotten it from the same source as all the other patients. Julia closed her eyes as she thought about this new information. The news from Georgia was obviously distressing, But the fact that only one new case had emerged over the course of the last month was probably good news. If terrorists were trying to use the bacteria as a weapon, wouldn't there be many more victims by now? Julia was beginning to think that this outbreak couldn't be an act of bioterrorism. But if this outbreak wasn't bioterrorism, then what was it? Something was causing people to get sick all across the country, and the CDC had no idea what it was. As Julia walked back to her office, lost in thought, she suddenly felt resolved. Their investigation had indeed been thorough and comprehensive, but clearly they had to do more. A few weeks later, on a warm evening in the middle of August 2021, Josie Baker stood by Lila as her daughter's wheelchair was lowered from a van to the ground outside their home. Friends and family were gathered by the front door, clapping and cheering. After 2.5 months in the hospital, Lila was finally home. Josie was overwhelmed with emotion as she carefully pushed her daughter up a ramp that had been installed outside their house just a week prior. Lila's physical condition had stabilized and she was now breathing on her own. But as Josie watched Dustin lift Lila out of her wheelchair and gently lay her on her bed, Josie also knew that there was a long and challenging road ahead of them. Lila had still not regained her ability to speak or walk. Even holding her head upright continued to be a challenge. Josie had to accept a painful truth. There was a good possibility that her daughter had suffered permanent damage to her nervous system. And Josie had another worry. She still had no idea how or where Lila had picked up the bacteria. CDC investigators had not found the bacteria on their property, but it still seemed possible to Josie that it could still be lurking somewhere in their house. So she couldn't shake the idea that if they continued to live in this house, at some point somebody else in the family was going to get this disease as well. Later that same month, in one of the conference rooms for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Julia picked up a dry erase pen and started drawing on a whiteboard. Julia had been on the case for almost 2 months, and the agency still had no clue how the 4 patients had contracted this bacteria. Julia knew time was running out to solve this puzzle. The more time passed, the greater the chance that the source of the bacteria might be spread to other locations. So Julia thought, maybe if she just wrote down everything they knew on this whiteboard, that maybe somehow it would help her connect all the dots. Julia's colleagues watched as she divided the board into 4 columns, one for each of the patients. Under each column, Julia listed key details, including dates, medical symptoms, and environmental factors that could be relevant. As the board began to fill up, the team searched for any common factors that could help narrow their search for the source of the bacteria. At some point, Julia had written a ton on this board and just stepped back and looked at it. And when she did, she saw it. 3 of the 4 patients showed signs that the infection had entered their brains, including the patients in Texas, Georgia, and Minnesota. Julia realized that this common thread could be an important clue as to how the bacteria entered the bodies of these patients. If their brains were infected, the bacteria most likely entered their body through their noses rather than through a cut or something they ate or drank, because the quickest route to the brain was through the nasal cavity, meaning there was a very good chance that in all of these cases, the bacteria was somehow inhaled. Julia felt re-energized. Even though CDC investigators had now made multiple trips to the victims' homes to collect samples, Julia knew, now that they had this information about inhaling the bacteria, that they would have to visit all of them one more time. Minutes later, Julia left and headed back to her apartment and began to pack her suitcase. Over the weeks that followed, Julia and her colleagues returned to the homes of all 4 patients and retrieved more samples for testing. They collected anything and everything they could find that could possibly be inhaled, regardless of whether it could have come from Asia. Julia and her colleagues knew they were ultimately searching for a needle in a haystack, but they had to try. And so by September, Julia and the rest of the CDC team had sent hundreds of additional specimens to their laboratory for analysis. And finally, in October of 2021, Julia received a call from a microbiologist who was assigned to this case. The search was finally over. A sample retrieved from the Georgia site contained traces of the melioidosis bacteria. And so after hearing this, it didn't take long for Julia and her team to figure out how the bacteria actually made the trip from Asia to America, causing 4 Americans to be attacked by a bacteria so toxic that the government considered it a potential bioweapon. But in the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, the spread of the bacteria actually got an assist from a very unusual accomplice. Seven months earlier, in March of 2021, while Josie was watching Lila hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house, the family's beloved pet raccoon, Jinx, was busy ransacking their kitchen. Jinx was on a hunt for food, and he had made a huge mess as he opened every cabinet and drawer, ripping open boxes and bags in search of a tasty snack. Jinx eventually climbed onto the counter near the sink, and he saw a small bottle of liquid. The raccoon soon knocked the bottle off the counter, causing it to break open and spill onto the kitchen floor, releasing that very strong floral aroma into the kitchen. And then when Josie and the kids entered the house, Jinx made a run for it, hopping into that puddle and tracking that floral-smelling liquid throughout the house as he ran away to hide. The bottle that Jinx knocked off the shelf was a United States branded product that Josie bought at Walmart a few weeks earlier. And that same product had been purchased by all 4 of the households that had been struck by melioidosis. What Josie and the other families did not realize is that while they had all bought this American product at a local American store, it was actually manufactured and bottled at a factory near the southern tip of India. The bacteria that causes melioidosis was known to thrive in the wetter environments of this particular region of India. And somehow, in the process of manufacturing thousands of bottles of this air freshener, known as Better Homes and Gardens Lavender and Chamomile Essential Oil Infused Aromatherapy Room Spray, the bacteria got into the liquid inside. The bottles were then shipped to Walmart stores all across the United States. When customers used the product inside their home, particles of the melioidosis bacteria were sprayed into the air, where they were all inhaled by the people who lived there. Now, most of the people who inhaled the bacteria were healthy enough to fight off the bacteria, and they did not get seriously ill, but the victims in Kansas and Minnesota had other conditions that made them more vulnerable to this infection. And Lila and the young boy in Georgia were just so young that their immature immune systems were unable to fight off the bacteria before serious damage was done to their bodies. As soon as the source of this bacteria was identified, the CDC alerted Walmart, and Walmart quickly discontinued sale of the product and withdrew it from the market. Consumers who purchased the spray were told not to throw it away or pour it down the drain, since that could increase the risk of spreading the bacteria. Instead, they were directed to put the bottle inside of 2 Ziploc bags, then place it inside of a cardboard box, and then physically return it to a Walmart store. But that was not quite the end of this story. CDC investigator Julia Petrus eventually learned of a 5th potential victim of this strain of the melioidosis bacteria. Jinx, the Baker family's beloved pet raccoon, who died shortly after breaking the bottle that contained the contaminated air freshener. Julia hated the idea of disturbing Jinx's grave in the Baker's backyard, but there was a chance that the melioidosis bacteria had actually spread into the environment after he was buried. And so, on April 19, 2022, Julia and other CDC officials returned to the Baker's home in Texas and dug up Jinx's body. But after doing some analysis, Julia and the Baker family were relieved to discover that although Jinx had died of melioidosis, no additional bacteria was detected in the soil or vegetation surrounding Jinx's grave. As of late 2023, Lila Baker has not regained her ability to speak or walk. Josie quit her job at the animal hospital and devoted herself full-time to the care of her daughter. Sadly, the little boy in Georgia died from the infection. However, the other 2 human patients did make full recoveries. Snowy Mountain, frantically digging into the deep powder. The sun was already low in the sky, which made him all the more desperate. He normally didn't work in the alpine backcountry, and in fact, he wasn't actually on duty at all. He was on a ski trip with a friend, and they decided to ski away from the marked slopes at the resort. and now his friend was trapped somewhere underneath all this snow. The paramedic redoubled his efforts, knowing that every second counted. His arms were burning with fatigue, but he just kept on digging. Finally, his gloved hand brushed against something soft and fleshy, and so feeling excited, the paramedic used both hands and whipped away the snow until finally he could barely see the side of his friend's face. And so he kept on digging, and then when he saw his friend's snow suspenders, he just reached down and grabbed them and yanked his friend all the way out. But right away, the paramedic could see his friend was not breathing, and so he flung himself down and began administering CPR while begging his friend to please just breathe. But as he continued doing CPR, the paramedic knew his friend had been buried for 15 minutes, which was certainly long enough to do permanent brain damage, if his friend even survived at all. Going on a big, exotic vacation is supposed to be fun and exciting. You wait for weeks or months or even years to take a dream vacation to some exotic island or rugged mountains or some beautiful foreign city, and then you come home with all these memories that will last a lifetime. It's incredible. Or at least that's what's supposed to happen. But in today's stories, people's once-in-a-lifetime travels end up bringing them right to the edge of death. Our first story is about a man whose ski trip goes wrong in the worst way possible, leading to a very strange condition that leaves his doctors scratching their heads. And our second and final story today is about a young woman whose travel study in Ghana teaches her a dangerous lesson she'll never forget. Here's our first story, The Buried Brain. Noah Schneider felt a rush of excitement as he glided on his skis down the side of a mountain. It was November of 2008, and the 25-year-old from Munich, Germany, had spent the past few days at a ski resort, happily racing through the snow with his friend Simon. Noah came to a stop and paused to enjoy the view. He and Simon were far away from the resort. They were out in the backcountry, where the terrain was much more rugged. Noah loved how wild the backcountry was, and how the surrounding forests filled the air with the smell of pine sap. Noah looked up above him and saw Simon was working his way down the slope as well. Noah was ready to get going, so Noah took a deep breath and then launched himself down a wide-open snowfield full of deep powder. But just a few turns later, he felt the snow under his feet begin to shift, and then suddenly it completely gave out underneath him. Noah's heart leapt into his throat as he was pulled down into a river of snow. Then the snow loosened and began to slide down the mountain. It was an avalanche, and there was nothing he could do to get out of it. Noah tried as hard as he could to try to find the way up to get his head out of the snow, but he was flailing his arms, and as the momentum turned his body from side to side, he was left feeling totally disoriented. He could feel himself rushing down the mountain, but the snow had now blocked out the sun, and it was too dark to see anything, so he had no idea where he was and what direction was what. Noah wanted to scream and try to get someone to hear him, but as the avalanche grew, as it rushed down the mountain, the weight of all the new snow piling on began pressing down on his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe, let alone speak or yell. Noah knew if he couldn't get out of here, he would be buried alive. And so, as Noah tumbled down the mountain inside of that dark snow, he was left thinking of his family and friends who he would never see again. But the next thing Noah heard was a soft and steady beeping. He faded in and out of consciousness as he slowly came to, but then he began to recognize the rhythmic whirring and buzzing of what sounded like medical devices. His head was pounding and his eyelids were heavy, but he managed to open them just enough to take in his surroundings. He was propped up in a bed in a beige, clinical-looking room he didn't recognize. Next to him, a blue curtain was drawn, cutting the room in half. Noah realized he was in a hospital. He had somehow survived. He just had no idea how he actually had survived or how he had wound up here. A few moments later, Noah heard approaching footsteps on the tile floor. He opened his right eye just a sliver, and he saw a tall woman wearing scrubs handling one of the machines near his bed. He tried to say something to her, but when he opened his mouth, no words came out. He just basically breathed out, and that was it. But him breathing out was actually enough to get the nurse's attention. She looked over at him and smiled and told Noah she was glad to see him awake. Noah swallowed, which actually hurt a lot. It felt like his entire trachea was bruised. But he tried to speak again, and this time he was able to whisper something. He asked her what happened. The nurse explained that the previous day, Noah had been caught in that avalanche, and then he was trapped under the snow for about 15 minutes. But luckily for Noah, his friend Simon, who was a paramedic, had been able to find him, dig him out, and perform CPR. That had saved his life. Noah slowly nodded, and then suddenly understood why it hurt so much to breathe. He'd seen Simon perform CPR before, and he knew that chest compressions could be hard enough to crack a rib, and so maybe that's what happened to him. The nurse told Noah that he had been flown to the hospital by helicopter, but by the time he landed, he was barely alive. He had a ruptured spleen and a hip fracture, and for a long time while he was crushed under the snow, he hadn't been breathing. The nurse explained that that's called hypoxia, when there's no oxygen getting to the brain, and she said that, frankly, the hospital staff could not believe he had made it out alive with that much time without oxygen. Noah didn't quite know what to say, so he stayed quiet. The nurse didn't seem to mind. She just told him to rest, and that it would take him a while to recover fully from this kind of accident. Noah gave her a half smile, and then closed his eyes and went to sleep. Several weeks later, Noah gritted his teeth as he tried to stand upright while holding on to some parallel bars. He had been at a rehab facility near Munich for a few days, and so far, he liked his new surroundings. It was quieter than the hospital, which made it easier to relax and sleep. Plus, he had physical therapy sessions every morning, which he knew were helping him regain his strength. Noah kept his eyes on his physical therapist, who was standing at the end of the bars, as he inched his way along toward her. His fractured hip was really burning from muscle exhaustion, but Noah kinda loved the challenge. When he first got to the rehab center, he'd been barely able to sit upright in a chair. But he'd been pushing himself every day, and now he could almost make it down the whole 10-foot-long section of bars before he had to collapse back into his wheelchair. Noah hoped he'd be upright and walking again by the end of February. That way, he could get back to school and finish his studies. So he willed himself to keep on going down the bars. When he finally reached the end of the bars, his physical therapist helped him sit down in his wheelchair and then gave him a high five. Noah smiled and leaned his head back, feeling proud of himself. It was the first time he'd gone the entire length of the bars, and he'd only been at the rehab facility for 3 days, and so he was hopeful he'd be able to be discharged much sooner than he thought. An hour later, Noah leaned back on the bed in his room, watching TV and opening a care package that his friends had sent him. He was grateful for the distraction. Aside from his morning therapy sessions, he had the whole day to himself, and so Noah was feeling pretty bored. He sorted through the box, and then pulled out the packages of nuts and snacks, a little container of homemade cookies, an adult coloring book, and a big book of Sudoku puzzles. Sudokus are puzzles where players put numbers into a grid that contains a total of 81 squares. The idea is to fill every row, column, and group of 9 squares with the numbers 1 through 9 without repeating them. Noah's face lit up when he saw the Sudoku puzzles. He liked solving them, and it was a lot more mentally stimulating than the boring TV reruns he'd been watching. Normally, he'd be in school and studying at this time of the day, but it was winter break and all of his books were back home, so he'd been running out of ways to keep himself occupied. He opened up a bag of gummy worms and popped one in his mouth, then rummaged through the box and found a pencil. Then he opened up his Sudoku book and began his first puzzle. But as he started filling in the boxes with his right hand, the fingers on his left hand started feeling shaky. He finally put the pencil down and tried to steady his left hand, but then his entire left arm just began convulsing. Noah reached for the call button with his right hand, which still felt normal. Then he grabbed his left arm with his right and just tried to hold it in place and stop it from shaking. But his arm just kept on convulsing, and so he took a deep breath and told himself, "It's okay, this is not a big deal, I'm gonna be fine." And just then, his left arm stopped convulsing and was just back to normal. As a nurse came flying into the room to see what was going on, Noah just stared down at his left arm in disbelief. The nurse asked him what was wrong, and he explained that he was pretty sure his left arm had just had a seizure, but now it had stopped. Noah kinda hugged his left arm to his chest and told the nurse that actually his left arm now felt sore. She nodded, but told him that unfortunately, there really wasn't much she could do about his arm. So she told him she would go inform his doctor about what happened to see if maybe she wanted to run some tests. Noah smiled and nodded, but inside, he was feeling very anxious. To this point, his recovery had been really nothing but steady progress, but now it felt like this was the first time he was kind of backsliding. The next morning, after he finished his physical therapy session, Noah asked his nurse to wheel him into the cafeteria for breakfast. She said yes and rolled him up to his usual table, then told him he could relax while she grabbed him some food. While he waited, Noah took out his Sudoku book. He picked up his pencil and flipped to the puzzle that he'd started yesterday before his seizure. He looked over the empty boxes and then began counting through different ways of solving the puzzle. But as he worked on this puzzle, just like the day before, there was this jolt of energy that kind of burst through his left arm, and then his arm was shaking and spasming all over again. One of the patients sitting at his table asked Noah if he needed help, and Noah, who was terrified, just nodded, and then he heard the patient call a nurse over. The shaking moved up Noah's left arm and kept shaking even when he grabbed it with his right hand. He could hear movement all around him, and he knew the entire dining hall was now looking over at him. Noah leaned back in his chair, still clutching his left arm, right as his nurse arrived. And when she did, Noah took a deep breath and then made eye contact with her, doing his best to try to breathe deeply and evenly and try to block out everything else around him. He was basically trying to stop panicking. And as he focused on just the nurse's face and on his breathing, slowly the shaking in his left arm actually dissipated. After Noah told the nurse that, his left arm was back to normal, the nurse bent over him, kind of puzzled, and inspected his arm, and then she asked him if the seizure he had just felt like the one from the day before. And Noah nodded and said, yeah, it felt identical. The nurse nodded and told him to wait right there. She was going to grab Noah's doctor immediately. A few minutes later, Noah sat on his bed while his doctor took his vitals. She shone a flashlight in his eyes, then asked him to follow the movement of her finger while she drew a big square in the air in front of him. After following her finger for a moment, she put it down, and Noah gave the doctor a half smile and kind of wrapped his fingers on his knees, which was something he did when he was nervous. He watched as the doctor scribbled a few notes, then she asked him to tell her what he remembered of the seizures. What was he doing right before they started? What was he thinking about? How was he feeling? Noah told her that both times he had this seizure in his left arm, he'd been eating something and also doing a Sudoku puzzle. He'd felt relatively calm, almost bored before it happened. His back had felt a little sore during the seizures, but he thought that was just from how much he had been sitting and lying down recently. He couldn't remember what he had been thinking about before the seizures, so he told the doctor that he really wasn't thinking about anything. He was just trying to solve these puzzles. The doctor thought for a second, and then told Noah that she'd actually like to try to recreate the moments right before the seizures as best as they could. So she grabbed a Sudoku book from the bedside table and handed it to him, and asked him to start solving a puzzle. Noah nodded and opened up the book to the puzzle that he'd earmarked, and almost as soon as he began trying to solve it, his left arm began to visibly spasm. He looked up at the doctor, who was staring back at him in total disbelief. She told him she was calling a neurologist right now. The next day, Baron Feddersen, who was a neurologist, looked in on his new patient from the hallway of the neurology wing at the University of Munich. Through a glass window, he could see Noah in a hospital room filling out a worksheet of complex math problems and also a crossword puzzle. Dr. Feddersen suspected that Noah's seizures were somehow being triggered when Noah tried to solve puzzles. He watched as Noah worked on the math problems, expecting his left arm to begin shaking, just like when he had solved the Sudoku puzzles. But after about 10 minutes of doing these math problems, Noah's left arm was steady, and so was his right. He finished his worksheets, then put his pencil down and looked up at Dr. Feddersen through the window. Dr. Feddersen frowned. He had been so sure that it was just trying to do math that would cause Noah's arm to seize. But clearly it was not just math, because that didn't do anything. So Dr. Feddersen decided that Noah should try another Sudoku puzzle, because maybe it was just Sudoku that triggered his seizure. So the doctor brought a Sudoku puzzle into the room, and he watched as Noah began to solve it, and within moments, Noah's left hand began to shake uncontrollably. Once the seizure had passed and Dr. Feddersen was sure Noah was okay again, he took a step back and just thought for a second. There had to be something unique about these Sudoku puzzles that was causing these seizures, but the doctor just could not understand what that kind of X factor was. What was it about Sudoku puzzles that was triggering this reaction from Noah? I mean, the doctor had never heard of a case like this in all his many, many years of practicing neurology. Finally, the doctor told Noah he'd be right back. He needed to go run some tests. 30 minutes later, Dr. Feddersen watched as a nurse secured a cap containing sensors and wires to Noah's head. Then Dr. Feddersen turned his attention to his computer screen right as the nurse handed Noah a Sudoku puzzle. As Noah began working on the Sudoku puzzle, Dr. Feddersen watched squiggly lines appear on his monitor. These were Noah's brain waves, and at first, Noah's brain activity looked completely normal. Then, a section right in the middle of the screen, right in the center of Noah's brain, began to light up, just as his left arm began to shake. Noah put his pencil down as the nurse moved a bit closer, and within a few moments, the seizure stopped, and his brain waves went back to normal. Reviewing the chart, Dr. Feddersen could see Noah had just suffered a classic seizure. But there was one little piece of brain activity that caught Dr. Feddersen's eye, and he realized he needed to ask Noah some questions about the way he solved Sudoku puzzles. And what he learned shocked and amazed him. It turned out that Noah pictured the Sudoku numbers in a three-dimensional grid, like a big blank cube that he could fill with numbers. Imagining the puzzle that way activated the part of his brain used for spatial reasoning called the parietal lobe. During the avalanche, while Noah was buried under the snow and unable to breathe for 15 minutes, the lack of oxygen had killed neurons in this part of his brain. So now, when he tried to use spatial reasoning to solve these Sudoku puzzles, he was overstimulating his parietal lobe, which caused a seizure. And because he did not think in 3 dimensions when he did simple math problems or crossword puzzles, those didn't trigger a reaction at all. Dr. Feddersen told Noah that there was no cure for these seizures, but he might be able to keep doing Sudoku if he imagined the numbers in a more traditional 2-dimensional way. But Noah actually was not able to work on the puzzles that way. He was too rooted in the way he typically solved these puzzles, and so ultimately he just gave up Sudoku altogether. After that, Noah's seizures disappeared, and he was able to leave the rehab facility a few weeks later. Other than giving up Sudoku, one of his favorite games, he would make close to a full recovery. Lag. On July 3rd, 2010, Kelly Granger walked out of the arrivals gate at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. She had a huge smile on her face, not just because she was happy to be home after more than 6 weeks away, but because her travels had changed her life. After finishing her sophomore year of college, 19-year-old Kelly had gone abroad for study in the African nation of Ghana. Kelly was an anthropology major, and she'd studied modern and traditional Ghanaian life while also volunteering to help Ghanaian people in need. On weekends, she and her classmates had traveled all over the country. She'd made some local friends she hoped to stay in touch with forever. All in all, this trip had been one of the best times of her entire life. Kelly made her way to the baggage claim area, where her family was already waiting for her. She already missed Ghana, but she had to admit that it was good to be back in New York and to feel the warm embrace of her mom and dad. She was also exhausted and ready to get home and sleep off the jet lag after crossing 4 time zones during her long flight. But over the next few days, Kelly had trouble shaking off her fatigue, and she had a very persistent headache. She figured these things would just go away once she got fully readjusted to being back in this time zone, but when Kelly woke up on the 5th morning after she got back, her headache was worse than ever. She rolled over and realized she was drenched in sweat. In fact, she was feeling so sick, she couldn't even get out of bed. So she wrapped her comforter around her more tightly and called for her mom, Gina. Then she laid in bed, shivering with her eyes closed, until she heard her mom come into her room and sit beside her on the bed. After her mom put a hand on Kelly's forehead and felt how warm she was, she told Kelly she was going to take her to the doctor. Gina just had a feeling that whatever was going on with her daughter seemed more serious than just jet lag or a little bug she'd caught on the way home, and so she wasn't going to take any chances. That afternoon, Kelly sat on her doctor's examination table with a thermometer in her mouth. She kept her eyes closed, as though that might get rid of the terrible headache that was pounding in her temples. Her doctor asked her if she was on any medications, and Kelly shrugged, as if to say, sort of. While she was in Ghana, she had been taking a malaria prevention medication called mefloquine, but she'd stopped taking it when she left, even though that was kind of recently, and since then she had not taken anything else. Suddenly, the thermometer beeped, and so the doctor gently pulled it out of Kelly's mouth. He told Kelly she did have a mild fever, but nothing too alarming. Then he quizzed Kelly about whether she had always remembered to take her anti-malaria pills. Mefloquine is highly effective, he said, but only if you take it every single week. You can't miss taking it. Kelly's mind was fuzzy from her headache, but she felt positive she'd taken the medication. Her school had made a big point of reminding her and everybody else that they had to take it every single week. The doctor nodded and sat back in silence for a moment, and then he told Kelly and her mom that this looked like just a very bad case of jet lag. In some people, that groggy feeling can last for a week or more, and the best treatment is just to rest. And so the doctor told Kelly to go home and rest and come back in a week if she still didn't feel better. 2 nights later, Kelly rolled from side to side in her bed. It was nearly 3 a.m., and while she was usually a sound sleeper, this night her headache and nausea were so bad she was finding it really hard to sleep. It also felt like her fever was spiking, and her chills were so bad that her teeth were actually chattering, but every time she pulled her comforter around her to warm herself up, she'd start to sweat. It was like she was alternating between being stuck in a furnace and a freezer. Finally, out of just sheer exhaustion, she did begin to drift off to sleep. And all of a sudden, Kelly heard a low voice calling out to her from somewhere in her bedroom, and it was saying something extremely strange and kind of threatening. She would soon be moving on to the next step, the voice said, but it warned Kelly not to tell anyone or she'd be sorry. Kelly was so scared that she jolted awake. But there was no one in her room, and her room seemed totally normal. Morning light filtered through her curtains, bathing her room in a reassuring glow. But Kelly still felt terrible and clammy and cold, and she was even panting like someone had just been chasing her. She told herself whatever had just happened had to have just been a bad dream. But at the same time, Kelly did not want to be alone right now. So she got out of bed and went downstairs where she could hear her mom and sister in the kitchen making breakfast. Kelly's mom looked up when she went into the kitchen and she asked Kelly how she slept. Kelly wanted to give an honest answer about this weird voice she heard in her room that maybe was in her dream and maybe wasn't, but then she remembered what that weird voice had actually said. Basically, don't tell anyone about the voice. Now, Kelly was not superstitious, but for some reason, she obeyed the voice's commands. So without mentioning the voice to anybody, Kelly just sat down at the kitchen table and said she slept just fine. The next morning, Kelly awoke in a cold sweat again, clutching her chest. The deep voice was back again, telling her she was nearly ready for the next step. Kelly couldn't help but feel scared, even as she told herself that, probably her fever was responsible for making her dreams so vivid, to include strange voices. But regardless, Kelly got out of bed to go brush her teeth. However, when she got to her bedroom doorway, she stopped. She looked down the hallway and realized she had no idea where the bathroom was. She looked at the other doors in the hallway and the stairs leading down to the foyer, but somehow nothing looked familiar. For a moment, she wondered if she was actually still asleep. But no, she was not. This was no dream. As Kelly began walking down the hallway, the floor began to move, knocking her off balance. She fell into the wall, then held it for support as she stood upright. She tried to walk again, but now the walls were bending and warping. The stairs began to slide away from her, and each door in the hallway slowly moved up and down and up onto the ceiling. Kelly kept trying to get her footing, but every couple of steps, she just hit the wall again. It was like the walls were jumping out to knock her off balance. So Kelly sank down onto all fours and began to crawl to the steps that led downstairs, where she knew her mother would be. When she reached the stairs, Kelly closed her eyes and sat on the top step. Then slowly she began to slide down each stair almost like a slide. Finally, she reached the bottom of the stairs and felt the hardwood floor beneath her feet, and at this point she was able to actually stand. And right away she thought to herself, I need to find my mom. Gina was standing over the stove scrambling eggs when Kelly came into the kitchen with a blank look on her face and totally covered in sweat. As Kelly walked toward her mother, she kind of staggered into the wall. Gina exchanged confused glances with her other daughter, Jessica, who was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for eggs, and then Kelly stumbled over to the table too and sat down, staring at the wall. Not really sure what was going on with her daughter, Gina just asked Kelly if she'd like some scrambled eggs too. But Kelly didn't answer. Instead, she began mumbling under her breath, speaking nonsense and still just staring at the wall like she was having a full conversation with someone Gina couldn't see. Gina called Kelly's name, trying to get her attention, and asked who she was talking to, but Kelly did not seem to hear her. Gina turned off the stove and walked over to Kelly and put a hand on her forehead, and she could tell she was warm to the touch. And so between that and the fact that Kelly was basically not responsive, told Gina this was an emergency. Gina did her best to stay calm, and as she went to grab her purse, she told her other daughter, Jessica, to get her shoes on, because they were going to take Kelly to the doctor's office. But when Gina tried to guide Kelly from the kitchen table towards the front door, she could see Kelly basically couldn't stand. She was very unsteady. And so at this point, Gina said, you know what? We're not going to the doctor's office. We're going to the hospital's emergency room right now. Later that morning, Gina stood in the corner of a hospital room at the Cohen Children's Medical Center on Long Island, New York. She hugged herself nervously as she watched an ER doctor and a triage nurse perform a head-to-toe examination of Kelly. Gina thought Kelly looked absolutely terrible. Under the bright fluorescent lights in the ceiling, Kelly's skin and eyes looked yellow, a condition Gina knew was called jaundice, but Gina had never seen it in person before. A moment later, the doctor confirmed that Kelly did have jaundice, and that could be a sign that she had a blood disease or a liver infection like hepatitis B. The doctor explained to Gina that he would have to call in an infectious disease specialist to take over Kelly's case because jaundice could be life-threatening. Gina felt a knot form in her stomach, and the feeling only grew when she looked over at Kelly's terrified face. Kelly was not entirely lucid, but it looked like she just heard what the doctor said and understood that whatever was wrong with her was quickly turning dangerous. Gina thanked the doctor as he stepped out of the room. Then she sat on the edge of Kelly's bed and held her daughter's hand while they waited for this specialist. Minutes passed, and the longer they waited, the more Kelly seemed to slip farther and farther away from reality. Her eyes were roving around the room without really focusing on anything. Gina tried to get Kelly's attention over and over again, but her daughter just kept kind of looking around and sort of babbling. By the time the specialist finally knocked on the door, Kelly seemed fully delirious. The specialist introduced himself as Dr. Sunil Sood, but Gina did not waste time introducing herself. Instead, she just hopped off the bed and directed Dr. Sood to Kelly and said, "Please help her." Dr. Sood walked across the room and immediately began assessing Kelly. After just a few moments, he turned to Gina and confirmed that Kelly did seem delirious, which unfortunately was a very bad sign. It meant that whatever Kelly had was rapidly evolving and now causing neurological complications. The doctor said he needed to order a full blood workup right away and hoped it would tell him what was wrong with Kelly. 45 minutes later, Gina, Jessica, and Kelly's father, Albert, paced in the waiting room until Gina finally spotted Dr. Sood walking down the hallway toward them. Gina held on to Albert for support as Dr. Sood cleared his voice and then explained to the parents that he did know what was wrong with Kelly. She had malaria. Gina shook her head. That was impossible. She promised Dr. Sood that Kelly had taken the medicine to prevent malaria while she was in Ghana. She asked him if maybe this could be something else. But the doctor said there was absolutely no mistaking malaria for something else under the microscope. He wasn't sure how this happened, but Kelly's blood was full of the parasites that cause malaria. These parasites were attacking her red blood cells, and in response, her immune system had launched a massive counterattack to fight the malaria off. But now, the battle between the disease and Kelly's immune system had caused such intense inflammation that her heart, liver, and other organs were in danger of failing. Dr. Sood explained that normally malaria could be treated with drugs. But at this point, Kelly had such a huge number of these malaria-causing parasites in her body that no drug would be able to kill them all without also killing Kelly. There was only one treatment that might help Kelly, however, it was drastic. Instead of trying to treat the disease with drugs, Dr. Sood proposed actually removing the infected blood cells from Kelly's body and replacing them with healthy donated blood. But to do that, Dr. Sood needed to remove up to 3/4 of the blood in Kelly's body and replace it with clean, healthy blood. The healthy blood, coupled with antibiotics, could then fight off the rest of the infection. The doctor admitted this was sort of a long shot, but it was very likely Kelly's only shot at survival. Dr. Sood assured the family that the health risks of actually replacing Kelly's blood with other blood were relatively low, but it was far less clear whether this procedure would actually allow her to successfully fight off the malaria. And so, for the next several hours, Gina sat by her daughter's bedside as the infected blood was extracted from her body and the new blood was fed back into her body through other tubes. The entire time, Gina prayed as she never had before. Finally, the last of the new blood trickled into Kelly's arm, and all of the bad blood was out by this point, and so Dr. Sood came back into the room to tell Gina that Kelly's procedure was now over. And so now her daughter would stay unconscious for a while as her body adjusted, and then everybody would just have to wait at least several hours to see if this procedure had actually worked. After 3 long, anxious hours of waiting, Kelly's mother, Gina, could hardly stand it anymore. So she stood up and announced she was going to get some coffee from the vending machine. Basically, she just needed to do something to take her mind off this waiting. But just as Gina picked up her purse to leave, she heard a rustling noise coming from the bed. She whipped around and looked at her daughter, and Kelly's eyes were wide open and focused. She was looking at her father, and she smiled and said hi to him as though she'd just woken up from a nap. A few moments later, Dr. Sood strode into Kelly's hospital room and told Kelly and her family that the blood replacement strategy had worked. The malaria parasites were rapidly disappearing from her body. Gina smiled at him and thanked him over and over again for saving her daughter. But there was one thing that still didn't make any sense to her. She didn't understand how her daughter could have gotten malaria in the first place. Just then, Kelly cleared her throat. She was finally clear-headed enough to remember everything about the medication she'd taken. She said that she definitely took all of her anti-malaria pills, but there was one small thing she'd forgotten. Just before she came home from Ghana, she forgot to use bug spray when she took a hike in the rainforest, and she did remember getting bit by mosquitoes. But she always thought she was safe as long as she took her pills. Dr. Sood said that normally the medicine she was taking was all you needed to protect yourself from getting malaria. But Kelly was just very unlucky. The mosquito that bit her had carried a much more potent form of malaria that overwhelmed both the anti-malaria medicine and her own body's defenses. And before long, the malaria parasite had gone to work destroying her red blood cells and cutting off oxygen to her organs, which had caused really intense hallucinations, like that weird voice she was hearing that was just a product of malaria, and then also jaundice. 4 days after the blood exchange procedure, Kelly went home, and in the following weeks, she made a full recovery. Kelly returned to college in the fall to continue pursuing her degree in anthropology, and she still has very fond memories of her time studying abroad in Ghana, despite the fact that that trip nearly killed her. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Hosted in foggy winter morning in 2001, 2 sanitation workers drove along the winding and rugged coastline of Western Canada. Moss-covered pine trees towered overhead, and they could hear powerful waves crashing onto the shore. The workers had been called out here to dispose of something that had washed up on the beach, and when the strip of rocky sand came into view, they could see something large and grayish-pink lying in the sand. It looked about 6 feet long, and from far away, it resembled a piece of driftwood or maybe some trash. But as they made their way down toward the water, the wind changed directions, and an awful smell hit them, pungent and rotting. That's when they realized the thing on the beach was the body of a dead porpoise. The men put on rubber gloves and masks as they got closer to the bloated, sand-covered carcass. The men exchanged troubled looks. It was unusual for a porpoise to wash ashore, and this was the 3rd time it had happened this month. The sanitation workers wrapped the porpoise up in a tarp and carefully brought it back to their truck. Then they hopped into the truck and drove off, watching the ocean disappear in the rearview mirror. But as they left, the driver felt a shiver run up his spine, because he couldn't shake the feeling that something horrible must be lurking off the coast. The summer of 2001, Arthur Labe sat inside a traditional German beer garden with his family. The middle-aged man lived on Vancouver Island in Canada, where he worked as a house painter. But now he was on his dream vacation in Germany, visiting relatives that he hadn't seen for years. He'd been looking forward to this trip for ages, and he was having a total blast. Arthur felt grateful to be on this vacation at all. A few months earlier, he had coughed up some blood, and his wife Carol insisted that he go see their doctor on Vancouver Island. The doctor would tell Arthur that he was worried about lung cancer, since Arthur had been a smoker when he was young. Thankfully, Arthur's chest x-rays and follow-up testing indicated he didn't have cancer, and his doctor said that it was fine for Arthur to go to Germany and enjoy his trip. And his cough actually cleared up completely a few days before he left for the trip. Arthur took a big swig of his beer and then thought about how great it felt to sit down and relax after a full day of walking all over the city. The walking was actually the only part of the trip that Arthur was not enjoying. They'd been on their feet so much that his lower back was starting to hurt. And so Arthur made a mental note to stop by a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel for some pain relievers or maybe a hot pad. Arthur took another big sip of his beer and then looked around at all the other tourists crowded into the beer garden. Then he nodded his head at the polka band in appreciation and then settled in, enjoying a sunny afternoon and the warm glow of a nice German beer. 2 hours later, the sun had sunk behind the trees, and Arthur stood up from the table to head back to the hotel. As he got to his feet, a shock of pain burst through his lower back. Arthur immediately sank back into his seat, very surprised. Then he tried to stand again, but every time he moved, a burning pain shot through his back and up his spine. Carol was surprised that her husband couldn't stand and asked what was wrong. Arthur told her he just needed to breathe for a second, but after a few minutes, the pain was still shooting up his back. And every time he tried to stand up, the pressure on his back was blinding. Finally, he just shook his head and told Carol he did need to go to the hospital. Something was going on with his back. She nodded, then asked their son-in-law, Brian, to run and grab their rental car. 15 minutes later, Arthur sat in the front passenger seat as Brian drove towards the hospital with Carol and Arthur's daughter, Jenny, in the back seat. Every time the car hit a bump, Arthur gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur could feel a brutal headache coming on too, and he wondered if the way he was feeling now had anything to do with that nasty cough he had back home. Finally, the car turned a corner, and Arthur saw the hospital up ahead, and not a moment too soon, because right at that moment, Arthur's vision had begun to blur, so he was leaning his head against the headrest and closing his eyes. He felt hot and achy, and his forehead was dripping with sweat, and by the time the car actually stopped, Arthur felt delirious. In fact, Arthur barely noticed as his car door opened and 2 hospital staff reached in to help him stand up. An hour later, Arthur opened his eyes and realized he was lying on his side in a hospital bed with an IV drip in his arm. Slowly, the beige room came into focus. He could hear the whirring and beeping of machines in the room, as well as conversations drifting in from the hallway. The room suddenly felt chilly, and Arthur hoped that his fever might be breaking. His headache was getting less intense too, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt like he could actually think clearly. Arthur looked down towards the foot of his bed, and he saw Carol speaking to a middle-aged doctor in a very quiet voice. When Carol noticed Arthur was awake, she smiled at him, but Arthur knew his wife well, and he knew the look she was giving him was her putting on a very brave face. Something clearly was wrong. At this point, the doctor turned to Arthur and introduced himself as Dr. Gent. He told Arthur that while he was unconscious, they'd performed a spinal tap so they could examine his spinal fluid for potential infections, and the lab work had just come back. Dr. Gent kept a neutral expression as he told Arthur that his spinal fluid had a high white blood cell count, which indicated that his body was fighting an infection. Dr. Gent suspected that Arthur had a very serious condition called bacterial meningitis, which meant that the membranes that protected his brain and spinal column were swelling. He explained that meningitis is a potentially life-threatening infection, but they had already started Arthur on antibiotics, so he should make a full recovery. Arthur felt overwhelmed by everything the doctor was saying, and he just wanted to know how long it was going to be before he felt better again. But before he could ask any questions, Dr. Gent told him to try and rest. He was going to be in the hospital for a few days at least. A week later, Arthur's daughter, Jenny, was getting ready to go to work on Vancouver Island. Jenny had decided to fly back to Canada while her father was still in the hospital, but she couldn't stop worrying about him. So far, doctors in Germany had tried 6 different antibiotics, but her dad didn't respond to any of them. He just kept getting sicker. Jenny was about to head out the door when her phone rang. She lunged for it, knowing it was the time her mother usually called from Germany. For a split second, Jenny hoped that her mom was calling to say her dad was all better, and they were just going to resume their vacation and everything was great. But as soon as Jenny picked up the phone, she could hear that her mom was crying. Carol told Jenny that the swelling in her father's brain was getting worse, and now Dr. Gent was saying that it looked like her father was going to die. Jenny had not prepared herself for the possibility of losing her dad, and she scrambled to think of some way she could help. Finally, she offered to drive over to her dad's doctor's office here on Vancouver Island to basically fill in Arthur's primary care doctor about what was going on, to see if maybe he had some ideas that the doctors in Germany had not tried yet. An hour later, Jenny fidgeted as she watched her father's doctor in Vancouver Island review her dad's scans on a computer monitor and flip through his lab results. He asked Jenny a few questions about her dad's condition, and she did her best to fill in the blanks. Finally, the doctor closed the files and turned to her, and she sat up expectantly. But he just shook his head and told Jenny that despite her father's serious illness, his charts looked remarkably normal. The doctor told her that her dad was in good health when he left for Germany. He might have picked up a bug while on the trip, but his infection should be responding to antibiotics by now. Jenny begged the doctor to please just look one more time, and then Jenny held her breath as the doctor did pick up the lab results and looked them over one more time. Then Jenny noticed the doctor's expression change, like something had just occurred to him. Then he leaned in and he told Jenny there was one possible but highly unlikely explanation. Jenny asked him to please tell her. At this point, her family was willing to consider anything. So the doctor explained that several weeks ago, her father's blood work had shown no signs of lung cancer, and they had rejoiced. But lost in the excitement was some less positive news. Arthur's blood had tested positive for a fungal infection called Cryptococcus. A lot of people get Cryptococcus, which had existed on Vancouver Island for years. But it's usually harmless, and most people's immune systems fight it off easily. It's only dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. And Arthur's immune system at the time was fine, so the doctor didn't even tell Arthur that he had this fungal infection. Jenny asked if this fungus could cause meningitis, and the doctor nodded, but only in extremely rare cases. However, if her father's meningitis was caused by a fungal infection, he would need completely different medications than what he was receiving in Germany right now. Antibiotics cannot stop a fungal infection. If Jenny's father had fungal meningitis, that would mean that for the past few days, the treatments Arthur was receiving in Germany were doing nothing. Jenny tried to stay calm as the doctor placed a call to the hospital in Germany. If they started Arthur on antifungal medication right now, he might survive. Jenny just hoped they weren't too late.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rossi.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible, and if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
Several months later, in the early winter of 2002, an animal pathologist named Sally Lester was in her laboratory on mainland British Columbia, a few miles away from Arthur's home. She slid a glass slide under her microscope, then bent down over the eyepiece to take a look. The slide she had put under there contained tissue from the carcass of a dead porpoise that had washed up on the beach on nearby Vancouver Island. Dr. Lester focused her lens on a tiny cell that looked like a boiled egg. This kind of cell had become a familiar sight to her over the past year. These odd egg-shaped cells had been sent to Dr. Lester from veterinary clinics all around Vancouver Island. A growing number of sick dogs and cats were showing up at vet clinics with shortness of breath and discharge running from their noses. In more serious cases, the animals were having seizures. Some had mysterious lumps on their heads, and all of the animals had pockets of pus called abscesses below their eyes. Veterinarians had sent in samples of the abscess tissue to Dr. Lester so she could examine them in her lab, and every time she'd found these little yellow cells that looked like boiled eggs. She knew what the cells meant, that the animals were infected with Cryptococcus, a fungus that grew on Vancouver Island. It was common for animals and humans alike to contract Cryptococcus by inhaling the spores floating in the air. Humans and animals rarely got sick from these spores. In fact, Dr. Lester usually saw no more than maybe 6 to 10 animals with Cryptococcus infections in a year. But recently, vets on Vancouver Island had been sending her about 10 cases every single month. Dr. Lester was stumped about what could be causing the number of these infections to rise so quickly. Then, porpoises began washing up on shore, which had given Dr. Lester a very eerie feeling. Dead porpoises should rarely wash ashore, but now it was happening every few weeks. And when she began reading the porpoise autopsy reports, she started feeling even more unnerved. The porpoise's lungs had been riddled with inflammation from pneumonia. Their organs were swollen and covered in flower-like tumors. And now, as Dr. Lester looked at the slide, she realized that all this damage was being caused by a Cryptococcus infection. The porpoise's blood was loaded with the fungus. Dr. Lester sat back on her stool, feeling a knot starting to form in her gut. She knew how porpoises would have contracted the Cryptococcus spores. Since spores are airborne, the fungus would have floated out over the ocean and settled on top of the water. The porpoises would have inhaled the spores when they came up and broke the surface to breathe. What she didn't understand was why the number of cases was increasing now. Something weird was definitely going on. And then Dr. Lester had a chilling thought. If more animals are getting fungal infections, maybe more people are too. After all, we all breathe the same air. Dr. Lester picked up the phone to call the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. She knew it was now time to get the human infectious disease authorities involved. Half an hour later, Dr. Murray Fife hung up the phone on his desk at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. He was the organization's head epidemiologist, and he had been absolutely swamped lately. And now, after speaking with Dr. Lester, he needed a moment to consider what she had told him about this potential outbreak of fungal infections on Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wanted to get feedback on Dr. Lester's concerns from a colleague who lived on Vancouver Island. So he picked up the phone again, this time to call the Vancouver Island Health Authority. The microbiologist who picked up said very matter-of-factly that Dr. Lester was right. There was a definite increase in human Cryptococcus infections on Vancouver Island, but not among the patients they would normally expect. Usually, it was just people with compromised immune systems that got sick from Cryptococcus, but lately, healthy adults were getting sick from the fungus. It was bizarre and basically unheard of. It made no sense to Dr. Fife. Cryptococcus fungus had been on Vancouver Island for years, so why was it suddenly so dangerous now? He worried that something about the fungus itself was changing, and he wondered if it could even be stopped. A few days later, Dr. Fife sat in a conference room totally surrounded by piles of hospital records and feeling completely exhausted. For the last week, he and a scientist at the University of British Columbia named Karen Bartlett had been combing the region's hospital records in hopes of finding other Cryptococcus infections. His eyes hurt from hours spent reading, but they still had not figured out when the number of infections had begun to rise. Dr. Bartlett cleared her throat and looked up while holding a file above her head. Dr. Fife raised his eyebrows as she explained that this file, was the oldest human case she'd found. It was from over 2 years ago, the beginning of 1999. The patient had been in good health when Cryptococcus made her sick, just like a lot of the recent cases. A few minutes later, Dr. Bartlett gasped and handed Dr. Fife another file. It was the medical records of a lively 45-year-old mother who had started to feel lousy just a few months ago in the fall of 2001. By the time the doctors tested her for Cryptococcus, the fungus had infected her brain and she died shortly after. Dr. Fife was shocked. He'd never heard of Cryptococcus killing an otherwise healthy adult. Even Arthur Labe, who'd been on death's door in Germany last summer, he'd recovered from his infection after receiving antifungal treatment. Suddenly, the stakes in their investigation seemed much higher. Not only were healthy adults contracting Cryptococcus, but the fungus was now, apparently, deadly, and Dr. Fife had no idea why. A week later, Dr. Fife was back at his desk, feeling both amazed and horrified at the unfolding health crisis. After he and Dr. Bartlett discovered that Cryptococcus infections were killing people on Vancouver Island, they'd sent samples of the fungus to a lab for further analysis. And now Dr. Fife was staring at the test results, and they weren't at all what he expected. The fungus that was infecting the animals and the people on Vancouver Island was an entirely new kind of Cryptococcus fungus than what had been on Vancouver Island for years. Under the microscope, analysts could tell that the new Cryptococcus was a completely different species from what residents were used to. But the new strain should never have been in Vancouver Island. The newcomer strain of Cryptococcus is typically found in the bark of eucalyptus trees in Australia and other warm places. It had never been seen so far north, and especially not in a cold and damp climate like Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wondered how a tropical fungus got so far north. There were hardly any eucalyptus trees on Vancouver Island, which meant that Dr. Fife had no idea where the fungus was hiding, or how it could even survive in this environment. Dr. Fife called Dr. Bartlett to explain the alarming lab results and admit he had no idea how to find this toxic new fungus. She paused, then told him she had an idea. She said it was time to get some boots on the ground. A week later, Dr. Bartlett stood on a residential street on Vancouver Island, surrounded by several students from a local college. These were her volunteers, and together they were going to comb the backyards and backwoods of all of Vancouver Island, searching for answers. Dr. Bartlett looked from student to student and reminded them of their objective. They would dig up soil samples and swab tree barks in the hopes that they would capture the new strain of Cryptococcus in the wild. Each student nodded and said they understood. So Dr. Bartlett divided them into teams. She sent 2 teams to collect samples around the neighborhood. Then she led her group to the first house on the street where the owner was expecting them. Dr. Bartlett was pleased to see that the homeowner, who was a middle-aged woman with tanned and sun-worn skin, was waiting in the garage. Dr. Bartlett waved as she and her volunteers walked up the driveway, and the woman led them around into her backyard. Dr. Bartlett had selected this house for a very specific reason. The homeowner, the woman, had survived a recent Cryptococcus infection. Dr. Bartlett hoped that the fungus might be found somewhere in this woman's immediate environment, but failing that, Dr. Bartlett thought that by interviewing this woman and other survivors, once she knew what they all had in common, she could use that information to track down the source of the fungus. Dr. Bartlett nodded to the students, and they fanned out into the backyard. She watched as they stooped over flower beds and scraped bark off trees, and while the students went to work, Dr. Bartlett interviewed the woman who lived there. Dr. Bartlett asked the woman where she went on a daily basis, and the woman listed off popular nature trails she liked to hike, beaches she frequented, and also the friends and family that she visited most often. Eventually, Dr. Bartlett had asked all her questions, so she thanked the woman for helping and then tucked her notes into her satchel. Then, once all her students were done taking their samples, Dr. Bartlett led them down the street to the next house on their list. A few days later, Dr. Bartlett sat in a conference room at the British Columbia CDC, going over her notes while she waited for Dr. Fife. Dr. Bartlett was feeling frustrated. After canvassing what seemed like the entirety of Vancouver Island, none of the samples that she or her volunteers had collected had come back positive for spores of this new type of Cryptococcus. And her interviews with all these survivors had led nowhere too. The only thing the infected people on her list had in common was that they all lived on Vancouver Island, which of course made it impossible to pinpoint where the spores were actually coming from. They could be anywhere on the island. A few moments later, Dr. Fife walked into the office with a grim look on his face. He told Dr. Bartlett that somebody else had just shown up at a Vancouver Island hospital with a Cryptococcus infection, which brought the total of people infected to 30 so far. Dr. Bartlett had this nagging sense that the situation, which was already bad, could actually still get much worse. The summer of 2002 was approaching, and she was worried that there could be an explosion of cases as the weather got warmer. She stood and began pacing the room, racking her brain for ideas. Dr. Fife leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. But then Dr. Bartlett stopped pacing. She turned to Dr. Fife and asked if he'd be up for a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights. He laughed a little because he always did late nights and they always worked all the time, but Dr. Bartlett could tell, he was up for more. So Dr. Bartlett explained what she had in mind. Since her interviews with infected people had failed to get the information they needed, she suggested they start talking to the owners of infected pets. There were so many animal cases that there might be an overlap in the animals' daily schedules. It was a long shot, but there was a chance that it would help them pinpoint where the fungus spores were coming from. Dr. Fife nodded and asked Dr. Bartlett if she'd like some coffee. If they were going to spend the next few weeks driving all over Vancouver Island interviewing hundreds and hundreds of pet owners, they would need a lot more caffeine. A week later, Dr. Bartlett climbed out of her car and knocked on the door of a house on Vancouver Island. A broad-shouldered woman with big brown eyes answered the door, and Dr. Bartlett followed her into the kitchen. This was the 24th pet owner that Dr. Bartlett had interviewed in person, so at this point, she basically had her questions memorized. She began by asking where the pet owner regularly took her dog. And the woman gave predictable answers, like hiking trails and restaurants and friends' houses. Except this time, the broad-shouldered woman also mentioned a place called Rathtrevor Beach Provincial Park. That name stuck with Dr. Bartlett through the rest of the interview because other pet owners had mentioned it as well, and so Dr. Bartlett felt like that place might be worth looking into. About 36 hours later, Dr. Bartlett met her student volunteers at Rathtrevor Beach and told them to swab everything. And 2 weeks after submitting those samples, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Fife had a startling realization. Fir trees all over Rathtrevor Beach tested positive for the new deadly fungus, and so the air in this park contained huge quantities of spores. And once Dr. Fife and Dr. Bartlett looked into this park further, the explanation for why this was became clear. Because of its location, the weather at Rathtrevor Beach was unlike the rest of Vancouver Island. It was warmer and enjoyed a drier, more Mediterranean climate. In other words, it was the perfect place for a fungus that prefers the warm, dry air of Australia rather than the typically chilly and wet Canada. So anybody who stopped at that park or just lived near it would have been breathing in these spores day in and day out. And most of the people who had contracted this infection were eventually found to have gone into or near this park. In the summer of 2002, Dr. Fife posted signs at Rathtrevor Beach Park warning people about the danger posed by this fungus. However, the park was not closed because Dr. Bartlett and her students eventually found spores in several other spots on Vancouver Island as well. So they realized there was really no way to actually contain the outbreak because clearly it basically had spread all around the island. Between 1999 and 2006, 165 human cases of Cryptococcus infections were reported in British Columbia. In total, 8 people died. As for Arthur Labe, he recovered from the disease once his hospital in Germany put him on that antifungal medication, and he was ultimately able to return to work, but his wife Carol says he's not quite as active as he used to be. Nobody knows how this fungus arrived on Vancouver Island, but the spores can live on surfaces for many, many years. So it could have been transported by humans, or wind currents coming up from the tropics, or even by porpoises that migrated across the ocean. Today, scientists are still working to find a way to prevent this infection, but currently, most scientists think there's really nothing we can do until humans and animals just naturally develop immunity to the disease. From Ballen's to early 2016, a 24-year-old graduate student used crutches to slowly make his way toward his professor's office. The student was wearing a large brace that wrapped around his waist and his right leg. When he finally made it to the office, his professor looked up at him in surprise and asked what happened. The student said he'd dislocated his hip. The professor, who also happened to be a medical doctor, looked totally shocked. He told the student that the hip was the most difficult joint in the entire body to dislocate. It only really happened when people suffered serious physical trauma, like from a car crash or a really bad fall. And so we asked the student, how in the world did you dislocate yours? And the student just said all he'd done was try to get out of his bed. On a weekday afternoon in 2007, 15-year-old Aaron Blocker had just gotten out of school. There wasn't much to do in his small town outside of Jackson, Mississippi, so he and a few friends were just hanging out in their high school parking lot, sitting in the bed of Aaron's grandfather's truck. Aaron's grandmother was a teacher at his high school, and his grandfather had come by to help her out after class. So Aaron and his friends were in the back of the truck, messing around like teenagers do, and at one point, Aaron went to jump out of the truck. But as he did, his foot got caught on the railing around the bed, and next thing Aaron knew, he did sort of a flip through the air and then landed hard on the concrete. His right elbow crashed into the pavement, sending a jolt of pain through his arm. It was like hitting his funny bone, but 1,000 times worse. The pain immediately brought tears to his eyes. Aaron heard his friends asking him if he was okay, and he managed to nod and say, "Yeah, I'm fine," and then he pushed himself up off the pavement. Instinctively, he gently began to feel around his right elbow where he'd landed, and he could tell that it was already very swollen. In fact, he wondered if he'd actually broken the bone. And that would be no surprise, because Aaron had a long history of breaking bones. Despite his young age, he'd already broken his fingers, his wrist, and his nose multiple times. Aaron had been born with bowed legs, so he walked a bit more clumsily than most people, and he did tend to trip and fall more than the average person. That's exactly how he'd broken his wrist, from tripping and falling. But really, Aaron chalked up his impressive list of broken bones to the fact that he was kind of a reckless kid. He'd broken his fingers falling out of the top bunk of a bed, and he'd broken his nose on a swing set. Jumping out of the truck clearly hadn't been the best idea, and now he'd hurt himself yet again. So Aaron clutched his elbow and began walking towards his high school to tell his grandparents what happened. And within just a few minutes of doing that, they were on their way to the hospital. And when they got there, Aaron immediately had an x-ray, and sure enough, he had broken his elbow. In 2009, the now 17-year-old Aaron found himself back in the hospital. But this time, it was not for a broken bone. It was for a dislocated shoulder. By this point in his life, Aaron had dislocated his shoulder more times than he could count. It happened with the smallest of force. Sometimes he'd wake up in the morning and his shoulder would just be out of the socket, like just from sleeping on it. He'd gotten so used to this that he was pretty much an expert at popping his joint back into place all by himself. But things had changed a year ago when he was 16, and Aaron underwent a surgery to stabilize his shoulder. Doctors had basically gone in and tightened the ligaments that were supposed to keep his joint in place. The surgery had been successful, and Aaron's shoulder hadn't dislocated since. At least, not until earlier that day, when Aaron had, again, made what was, in hindsight, a bit of a reckless decision. He'd gone to a trampoline park with some of his friends, and during all the chaos and jumping around, Aaron had, at some point, felt the all-too-familiar pain in his shoulder. And when he looked down, he realized, despite the surgery, his shoulder was once again dislocated. And so now, Aaron was sitting in a hospital, regretting the trip to the park. Just then, a doctor came into Aaron's hospital room with the results of some recent imaging scans. The doctor explained that Aaron had not only dislocated his shoulder, but actually torn the ligaments that his first shoulder surgery had fixed. So, if he wanted his shoulder to stay in place, he was going to have to undergo another surgery. Aaron was not looking forward to another operation, but he also didn't really have a choice. So he went under the knife yet again. And 3 weeks later, he walked across the stage at his high school graduation while wearing a sling. A year and a half after graduating high school, Aaron's life was very different in a good way. He was now 18 years old and attending a local community college, and he just celebrated his 1-year anniversary with his girlfriend, Emily. But despite all these positive things happening in Aaron's life, one thing had not changed. He still found himself lying in a hospital bed way more often than most other people his age. And that's where he was in January of 2011. And this emergency room visit didn't have anything to do with Aaron's bones or joints. Instead, he was there because he was having a severe flare-up of Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disorder that causes inflammation in the digestive tract. It can lead to painful gastrointestinal symptoms, weight loss, and even malnutrition. Flare-ups, when the disease is most active, can make patients so sick they can barely get out of bed except to go to the bathroom. Aaron had been diagnosed with Crohn's about a year earlier during his first semester of college. He'd gone through months of severe pain and diagnostic tests before doctors finally figured out what was going on. By that point, he was so sick that he had to be hospitalized to get his swelling under control and get some much-needed nutrition into his body. Aaron had been mostly alright since then, but he suspected that the stress of going to college may have triggered this particular flare-up, because now he was almost as sick as he had been when he was first diagnosed. Aaron heard a soft knock at his hospital room door. A member of the ER staff poked their head in and told Aaron that an orthopedic doctor was going to come by to see him. Aaron was confused by this. Normally, Crohn's disease was treated by a gastrointestinal doctor, not a bone specialist. He asked why, and the staff member just said it had something to do with one of the CT scans that they'd just done on his abdomen. Aaron didn't know what to make of that, but based on his long history of injuries, in particular bone injuries, he knew this could not be good news. When the orthopedic doctor arrived, he explained that Aaron's CT scans were meant to take pictures of his digestive system, but one of those pictures just happened to capture an image of Aaron's hip bones. And the picture showed there was something very wrong with both of Aaron's hips. The doctor said Aaron had something called a vascular necrosis, which meant that the blood supply to Aaron's hip bones was being cut off. As a result, his bones were literally dying. But the doctor didn't know why. Aaron was already so overwhelmed with his Crohn's flare-up that he couldn't really wrap his mind around this new health problem. He just felt emotionally numb from all the bad news. And once the doctor left, Aaron had no one to help him understand what it meant for him and his future. The next day, a different orthopedic doctor came into the room to discuss Aaron's diagnosis in more detail. And this doctor asked Aaron if he'd been on steroids recently, because long-term high doses of steroids were one of the most common causes of avascular necrosis. And Aaron said no, not really. He'd taken a low dose of a steroid called prednisone when he was first diagnosed with Crohn's disease, but that was over a year ago. The doctor said he'd never seen someone develop avascular necrosis from such a low dose of steroids, but it was possible that Aaron's body just had a very unusual reaction to prednisone. But regardless of what was causing it, the doctor recommended that Aaron follow up with an orthopedic surgeon about his hips whenever he got out of the hospital. Now, at the time, Aaron was under so much stress between college and trying to manage his Crohn's flare-up that he didn't connect the avascular necrosis with his long history of broken bones and joint dislocations. Instead, it just felt like one more medical problem that he would have to worry about. 2 years later, Aaron, who was now 20 years old, reviewed his most recent X-ray results with the same orthopedic doctor who'd previously diagnosed him with avascular necrosis. And shortly after that diagnosis, Aaron had met with a surgeon to see if he would need surgery on his hips. But that surgeon had told him that his hips weren't really that bad, and that his avascular necrosis was still in the very early stages. So all they needed to do now was just monitor his joints. But that was 2 years ago. And in the last few months, Aaron had noticed his hips getting a lot worse. It hurt to walk, and running was totally out of the question, so Aaron had made an appointment with the orthopedic doctor. And now, looking at Aaron's x-ray, the doctor said Aaron was correct to be worried. His avascular necrosis had definitely worsened over the last couple of years. It had been stage 1 out of 4, but now it was more like stage 3. The doctor told Aaron that some patients whose hips were as badly damaged as Aaron's were would consider getting a double hip replacement surgery. However, those patients tended to be much older than Aaron. And so before taking such a drastic step as doing a double hip replacement, the doctor suggested that Aaron consider a less extreme surgery called core decompression. This would involve drilling into each of Aaron's hips, purposely damaging the remaining bones, in the hopes that this would stimulate blood flow and his bones would grow back stronger. The doctor was honest with Aaron and said this surgery does not really have a high success rate, but it was worth trying before a surgeon replaced his hips altogether. Aaron could not believe that taking a short course of steroids years ago had potentially led to this. It just didn't seem right. But he understood what his doctor was saying and he trusted his doctor, So he went ahead and scheduled the less extreme operation for that summer, right after his college semester was going to be over. 3 months after the core decompression surgery, Aaron met with a surgeon to go over the results of a follow-up CT scan. The truth was, Aaron already knew that he was not making much progress post-surgery. He'd spent the last 12 weeks stuck in a recliner in his grandparents' living room, bored out of his mind. The only bright spots in his summer had been visits from his girlfriend, Emily. She'd recently finished school to become a barber and had started working full-time, and so she had plenty of crazy stories she'd heard to tell Aaron while he was stuck in that recliner. Aaron knew that at this point, 3 months after that operation, he should have been up and walking. But he was still in so much pain that he couldn't even put weight on his right leg. He didn't feel like the surgery had helped him at all. If anything, it had made his hip feel worse. And now the surgeon basically confirmed what Aaron already knew. The CT scan showed that his body was not rebuilding new healthy bone like they'd hoped. Instead, his hip was just continuing to die. Now they really only had one option left. Aaron was 20 years old and he needed a full-blown double hip replacement. If he didn't, his mobility would continue to decline and his pain would only get worse. The surgeon told Aaron that, even though it was very unusual to perform a hip replacement on someone his age, the surgery was statistically very likely to succeed. If they were able to go in and replace his dying hip bones with artificial ones, then his avascular necrosis would be cured and his problems should be solved. The only downside was, each surgery, meaning each hip surgery, left and right, would have to be done separately, and it would take Aaron close to a year to fully recover from both. Aaron hated the idea of an entire year of recovery. It meant he would have to take the next 2 semesters off of school, which he really didn't want to do, and he would have to spend more time stuck in that recliner. But Aaron was practically stuck in that recliner already since he couldn't walk because of his dying hips, so he knew he really had to do this. In December of 2012, Aaron used a walker to slowly shuffle down the hallway of the hospital's joint replacement floor. A few days earlier, he'd undergone his second hip replacement, and even though all he wanted to do was lay in bed and rest, hospital staff required him to get up and go to group physical therapy. So, Aaron slowly and painfully made his way into a room with the other joint replacement patients, who were all in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. One of the other patients looked at Aaron as he came in and just said, "You're really young." And Aaron replied, "Yeah, I am, but I'm here." He managed to say it with a smile, because even though this was one of the most challenging things he'd ever been through, overall, things in Aaron's life weren't all that bad. Just a few days before his surgery, he'd proposed to his girlfriend, Emily, and she'd said yes. So, despite all the negatives in his life, the surgeries and the physical therapy and being the youngest patient on the joint replacement floor, Aaron still had reasons to be hopeful. With the help of a physical therapist, Aaron pushed his way through a series of painful hip exercises, and the whole time, he just looked forward to the day that he'd be healthy enough to stand up and meet Emily at the altar.
Man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I am not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible. And if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
A little over 3 years later, on a weekend evening in early 2016, Aaron was lying in bed at home with the TV on. He could hear his wife, Emily, walking around in the living room, and Aaron smiled, because it still felt special to think of Emily as his wife. They'd gotten married in late 2013, once Aaron had recovered from his hip surgeries, Since then, he'd finished his bachelor's degree in biology and began a master's program in biomedical research. He was actually working on a research project about Crohn's disease, a disorder that he still had to manage in his day-to-day life. But overall, Aaron's health was in a good place, and he was grateful for that. Aaron looked up at the TV and then began looking around the room for the remote so he could change the channel. He saw the remote on the other side of the room, so he went to get out of his bed, and as he did, suddenly he felt the searing pain shoot through his right hip. It was the most excruciating pain he'd ever felt in his life, and he'd felt a lot of pain, worse than all of his broken bones and his surgeries. And as he's feeling this horrific pain, he tried to move his leg, but he couldn't. Aaron called out for Emily, and she rushed into the room and asked what was going on. Aaron said he couldn't move his leg and he thought something was seriously wrong. Emily tried to help him shift in bed and sit up, but he couldn't. It hurt way too much. Aaron knew he needed to get to a hospital and fast, but he couldn't walk, and Emily couldn't carry him. So he called a friend that lived a few blocks away, and 20 minutes later, the friend showed up, lifted Aaron out of his bed, and carried him out to the car, and then rushed Aaron and Emily both to the hospital. When they got there, Aaron underwent the usual X-ray and CT scan, which he was very used to by this point. And then afterwards, while Aaron was lying in a hospital room and holding Emily's hand, a member of the ER staff came in and told Aaron that the reason he had felt that horrible pain was that his hip joint was partially dislocated. It took an entire team of people to pop Aaron's hip back into the socket. He felt them grab his leg and push it hard, then he felt a white-hot flash of pain, and then finally some relief. His hip was still sore, but that searing pain he had felt was gone. Aaron was released from the hospital that same night, but he still felt very uneasy. His hip should not have just popped out of place for no reason, and he was worried something was wrong with the artificial joints he'd received during his hip replacement surgeries. So he planned to call his surgeon first thing Monday morning. On Monday, Aaron made that phone call, only to learn that his hip surgeon had moved out of state. Aaron called around to a few different clinics, but he couldn't get in to see another hip surgeon for at least 2 weeks. In the meantime, he went to an urgent care center where he got a hip brace and a pair of crutches just to get him through the long wait to see a doctor. He went to school in this condition, and one of his biomedical science professors, who was also a medical doctor, was shocked that Aaron had dislocated his hip doing something as simple as getting out of bed. And Aaron couldn't really explain it either, except to say, yeah, that's just what happened. When Aaron was finally able to see a hip surgeon, he got even more bad news. The surgeon went over his medical history, CT scans, and most recent X-rays, and told Aaron that, unfortunately, the problems with his hip bones had not been solved after all. That was because, even though both of Aaron's hips had been totally replaced with artificial joints, the bones around those artificial joints had continued to weaken. So, at this point, the bones in Aaron's legs and pelvis were so weak that they couldn't hold artificial joints in place anymore. And that's why his right hip had dislocated. And unfortunately, the surgeon said that the only way to fix this issue was for Aaron to undergo another double hip replacement, so they could switch out the artificial joints for bigger ones that would hopefully stay in place better. Aaron was so overwhelmed by this gloomy outlook that he kind of just went numb. So in the moment, he just told the surgeon, okay, yeah, we'll do whatever we have to do. But once he finished the appointment and got out to his car, the reality of his broken body hit him like a ton of bricks. He thought this problem with his hips was fixed. He'd gone through 2 operations and a year of recovery thinking he'd be cured, but he wasn't. Now he needed 2 more major surgeries, which would mean more pain and more recovery time, and Aaron didn't even know if all this suffering would help him in the long term. If his first hip replacements only lasted a few years, how did he know these ones wouldn't fail on him eventually too? Aaron started crying in his car so hard that he couldn't even see well enough to drive. So he just sat there sobbing in the parking lot for 20 minutes until he finally decided to call his wife. And Emily was as calm and comforting as ever. She told Aaron it was going to be okay and that no matter what, they were going to get through this. She managed to talk him down enough that he could drive his car, but Aaron didn't go home. He had class that day, so he went straight to school. In April of 2016, 24-year-old Aaron laid in a hospital bed after his third hip replacement. After he'd learned that he would need even more surgery, he had rushed to finish his semester in grad school early, and he'd been so stressed that he didn't really have time to think. But now that the surgery was over, he had to stay in the hospital for around a week. So for the first time in months, Aaron didn't have anything to do except to lay there and reflect on the health struggles that had shaped his life. By this point, Aaron was only about a year away from earning his master's degree in biomedical research, so he knew a lot about the human body. He knew that it was not normal for kids to wake up with their shoulder dislocated, like he'd done so many times. He knew that minor falls, like the one he'd taken as a kid, should not have led to a shattered wrist and a broken nose. And he knew that a small dose of steroids when he was 17 should not have led to him needing 4 hip replacements by the age of 24. Aaron just had this gut feeling that something more was going on with him. Something that all of his doctors up to this point had missed. Aaron knew himself better than any doctor could, and he felt like he had the skills and knowledge to figure this out. So he took out his phone and started Googling. 6 months later, in October of 2016, Aaron stood next to the printer in his college library, watching it spit out sheet after sheet of paper. Aaron had undergone his 4th hip replacement surgery in July, and now he'd recovered enough that he could get around campus on his own. He was working tirelessly to finish his master's degree because he refused to let his health problems get in the way of his education again. Over the past 6 months, he'd tracked down all of his available medical records. He'd found a lot online, but he'd also gone to a bunch of the hospitals and clinics in person so he could get the records that weren't available electronically. Then he'd gone over these documents with a fine-toothed comb, and he'd noticed something. Something that he thought might be able to explain the bizarre symptoms he'd experienced since he was a child. Aaron had access to a lot of scientific research papers through his school, and he took full advantage of it. He'd sifted through countless articles until he found some that talked about an incredibly rare genetic disorder that was associated with the exact thing he'd noticed in his medical records. The symptoms for this disorder pretty much exactly matched Aaron's. Being born with bowed legs, frequent joint dislocation, weak bones, and even a vascular necrosis. It all added up. But at the same time, Aaron didn't want to get his hopes up about a potential diagnosis and then be disappointed if he was wrong. So he kept his expectations low. The printer spit out one final piece of paper, and Aaron grabbed the stack of research articles that he'd printed. He was going to take these articles, along with all the medical records he'd gathered, to his primary care physician for a second opinion. That same month, Aaron sat inside of an exam room at his primary care physician's office. When the doctor came inside, Aaron handed him the thick stack of papers he'd printed out and said, "Look, I think I finally found something that makes sense." The doctor began to look over the documents, and he admitted he'd never even heard of this disorder before, but he agreed the symptoms were a very close match to Aaron's. So the doctor referred Aaron to a geneticist who might be able to finally, officially diagnose him. After many appointments with this geneticist and several months of testing, Aaron finally got a call in August 2017 confirming that his self-diagnosis was correct. And it was all because of that tiny detail that all the doctors had overlooked until Aaron pointed it out. When Aaron had scanned through his medical records, he realized that for his entire life, he'd had remarkably low levels of a crucial enzyme called alkaline phosphatase. Now, this didn't really raise any red flags for the doctors who treated him, because usually medical professionals are trained to worry about high alkaline phosphatase levels, not low levels like Aaron's, which is why nobody could correctly diagnose him. But when Aaron began looking into it himself, he learned that low alkaline phosphatase levels were associated with an extremely rare genetic condition called hypophosphatasia. Hypophosphatasia occurs when a person's body cannot make alkaline phosphatase properly. Without this critical enzyme, their bones can't absorb essential minerals like calcium, so their skeleton becomes increasingly brittle. This is what caused all of Aaron's bones to break, his joints to dislocate, and his hips to begin dying. A single missing enzyme had caused Aaron a lifetime of pain and suffering. Once Aaron got his official diagnosis, he found a doctor in Tennessee who specialized in treating hypophosphatasia. Aaron now takes an enzyme replacement injection 6 times a week, which also costs his insurance company over $1 million a year. While Aaron still has complications due to the skeletal damage he suffered before being diagnosed, this $1 million treatment has strengthened his bones enough that he has increased mobility and hasn't broken a bone in many years. Aaron and his wife Emily now have 3 kids together and live a relatively normal life, thanks to Aaron's persistence and Emily's loving care. And these days, Aaron says his wife treats him like a normal husband rather than a patient. After one recent surgery, she told him, and I quote, "I'm sorry if I act like this is too normal, but we've got kids. I need you to at least hold a baby for a minute." End quote.